Welcome to everyone here in the room and everyone on Zoom as well. My name's Ben Spies-Butcher. I work here at the Macquarie School of Social Sciences, and I'm also the co-director of the Australian Basic Income Lab. Before we kick off today, as a matter of protocol and as a mark of respect, I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we meet here on Aboriginal land, the land of the Wadawurrung clan of the Darug Nation, whose cultures and customs have nurtured and continue to nurture this land since time immemorial, and acknowledge that this land was never ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I'd also like to acknowledge traditional owners of lands across the country. We've got people coming in from all over the country we now call Australia, so acknowledge First Nations people from where you are too, and a special welcome to any First Nations people who are joining us for the seminar. This event is a collaboration between the Macquarie School of Social Sciences and particularly our Work, Inequality and Wellbeing research stream, and the Australian Basic Income Lab, a collaboration between our school here with the Crawford School at the Australian National University and the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Sydney. It also opens our program for Social Science Week, so welcome to everyone. And for those particularly who are in the room, we have a number of events over the next few days, so I really encourage you to turn up to all of them, and we might have a couple of people in the room who can spruik them at the end too. We're very lucky to have with us Dr. Joe Chrisp from all the way from Bath, where apparently it is now a very sunny day in the United Kingdom. Joe is a postdoctoral research associate at the Institute for Policy Research at the University of Bath, where he's working on the Economics of Basic Income project. Today, Joe is going to be focusing on the politics of basic income, drawing from interviews that he's conducted with policymakers and basic income advocates in the United Kingdom and in Finland. And I'll hand over to Joe in just a second. Just to let people know how this is going to work, following Joe's presentation, we're going to have two reflections from Australian scholars connecting Joe's findings with their own research here in Australia, Dr. Eve Vincent and Dr. Troy Henderson. And I'll introduce Eve and Troy more fully before they speak. So Joe's going to talk for about 15 to 20 minutes. We're then going to have the reflections from both Eve and Troy, an opportunity for the speakers to reflect on what each other have said, and then I'm going to open it up for questions both online and in the room. And I'm going to try and make sure that we finish promptly at 6 o'clock. So without any more to do, I'm going to mute myself and ask Joe to speak. Thank you, Joe. You're still on mute, Joe. So just can see your screen, so the slides are up, but you're on mute. So we just need you to unmute.
Sorry, I couldn't get the Zoom panel back, but I think you can hear me now, right? Yeah.
Yep.
Cool. Okay, so thanks so much for inviting me. Well, this morning for me,
some technical problems. So Joe, we can't hear it. No, you're not on mute, so that's something at our end. I think, Andrew, if I could ask you to just check the screen on that, or Francesco, yeah, the screen, and make sure that the sound is on. It's not the speakers aren't muted.
I can hear plain as day on Zoom.
Yeah, we can hear now.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Brilliant. Well, thanks so much again for inviting me to speak to you. Happy to see so many people have been interested in this event. I'm going to present hopefully a relatively brief summary of some of the research that I did during my PhD and a little bit afterwards, which focuses on the different ways that people visualize and think about basic income in different contexts when they're advocating for it in different environments, political environments and political institutions. And in particular, I want to introduce this idea of three different spheres of basic income politics, whether that's talking about policies, mirrors, or metaphors. And I'll talk a bit more about what that means later on. So I'm just going to briefly talk about some of the key findings from my PhD, but then also to kind of go into more detail about what I think is the more interesting element of it, which is to unpack what political parties and kind of different interest groups are really talking about when they support basic income. So probably most people in this call or in the room know what a basic income is. It's an unconditional income for every individual in a political community. And at the time that I was starting my PhD in 2016, there was this sudden kind of exponential increase in political interest in basic income, whether the Swiss referendum, the basic income experiments in Finland and in some Dutch municipalities, which then kind of snowballed into a global series of experiments and political events. But at the time, there was a kind of dominance of normative or descriptive academic research, what might be called the ethics and economics of basic income, and not so much on the politics. So that's really where I wanted to come in initially. And my two kind of main, if you like, research questions were what drove political support for basic income, and how did that support vary across countries, and of course what explained that variation. So to do that, I drew on kind of three main parts to my research. The first was to construct a kind of manifesto database to look at all the commitments to basic income that parties in Europe had made between 1980 and 2018, and trying to explain that. The second was to look at public attitudes and think about voter preferences for basic income, and then also to do case studies of the UK and Finland, as Ben mentioned, and that involved a number of elite interviews with politicians, people within trade unions, think tanks, and other kind of organizations that were in some way attached to political parties and governments. So both in terms of what drove public support, but also party support, one kind of quite common theme was the existence of labor market risks, and in particular unemployment for parties. So on the left, you can see a graph showing the kind of level of support for basic income from voters in each country, mapped against the level of unemployment, the poverty rate, inequality, and also real GDP per capita. And so in the places with higher unemployment, higher poverty, higher inequality, and lower GDP per capita, you saw more support for basic income. The graph on the right shows the level of support from parties at a given election, weighted by the level of support that party had. So if a political party got very few seats, then you would and supported basic income, it wouldn't be so high on the y-axis as if a very large party supported basic income. So as you can see, the higher the unemployment rate in most countries, the more likely a party was to support basic income if when weighted by their size. So in a sense, the unemployment rate in a given country, within a given country, is likely to drive support from political parties for basic income. So you had this kind of general sense that within a given country and across countries, labor market risks is in some way driving support for basic income. But I also found that the context really matters. So the likelihood of a left-wing party supporting basic income stays relatively constant, but in countries with high social expenditure, a right-wing party becomes much more likely to support basic income. And just intuitively, we might be able to think about why this might be. If you're in a country with very low social expenditure, there's no reason why they would support necessarily a basic income, because it's not going to replace anything. But as soon as you get to countries with very high social expenditure, a basic income might be appealing to right-wing parties as a way to replace either kind of expensive social insurance benefits, or even certain public services and so on. So clearly, if you like, the ways in which parties support basic income is going to be related to the context in which those parties operate. And in this case, whether a right-wing party or a left-wing party supported basic income was very dependent on the level of social expenditure. And a similar finding for public support. So I found that in countries where cash benefits are very poorly targeted, so there's very high earnings related benefits, or benefits in general have a kind of insider-outsider dynamic, where people with higher income are more likely to get a higher share of cash benefits. Basic income was often supported by those who supported targeting. So in a sense, basic income can be a kind of redistributive measure in contexts where there is a very poor level of targeting in the first place, whereas in countries where there already is a lot of targeting, there wasn't much difference between support for basic income depending on whether an individual supported targeting or not. So if you like, the level of targeting in a particular country influences how salient support for targeting is as a determinant of basic income. So the country's institutional context affects how salient particular dimensions of basic income are. And on the right, you can see the opposite thing happening for conditionality. So in countries where there is a high level of conditionality, basic income becomes supported more by those that support conditionality than those that are opposed. But in countries with very low levels of conditionality, there isn't much difference. So conditionality is not very salient for explaining support for basic income in countries that are not very conditional. And you can perhaps understand why that might be, because if you like, basic income becomes a representation of the antithesis of the existing system in many ways. And so if you already have an more unconditional benefit system, then that aspect of a basic income is not going to kind of speak out to those that are thinking of the policy. So those were kind of some headline findings that I had from the empirical part of the quantitative empirical part of the research. But what I really wanted to dig into was, in both of the analysis of parties and voters, in a sense, we're taking support for basic income as this kind of black box that we're not trying to dig into. What is it that parties are actually supporting when they support basic income? And what exactly are voters supporting when they say that, when they tick a box and say they are supporting basic income? And I've got a little bit more to say about what political actors mean when they support basic income, but I think also the kind of question of what the public really mean when they say they support basic income is also something that perhaps we can discuss a little bit more in the discussion. So the first thing I would say is that for parties that we often found the most kind of full-throated support from political leaders, as well as the rest of the parliamentary parties, often these were parties that were either small enough that they knew they would never have to lead a government in order to implement all of the manifesto that they committed to. So this was FAS, which is the Left Alliance in Finland, or the Green VIHR is the Green Party in Finland. So they are very vociferous supporters of basic income, but often they know that they have their arms tied behind their back. They're not going to win an election where they are leading a coalition government. They know that they're going to be, at best, coalition partners in the government, and so they know that they will be they can say they support basic income as much as they like, and they are unlikely to have to actually implement that policy. And another kind of interesting example of that was the Scottish National Party, or the SNP, who also had their arms tied behind their back in a different way, which was that, you know, a devolved government cannot implement a full basic income as is, and so they always knew that the central government in the UK was going to deny their request, even just for an experiment, and so they could kind of, you know, support basic income as much as they liked, knowing that they would not necessarily have to implement the policy. For bigger parties that express some support, such as, you know, the Labour Party in the UK under Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell, and also the Centre Party in Finland, often they've had quite a lot of internal division on the policy. And so even when the leadership showed support, it was always with very non-committal kind of promises, at best for an experiment, but also that, you know, they needed to take some time to consult, and they needed to think about this policy and think it through, and often not always making sure to caveat any kind of support with a series of conditions that would need to be met in order for them to take it to the next stage. So even when basic income is mentioned in manifestos as something that those parties support, often in more public statements throughout the period of a campaign, or at other times during the electoral cycle, lots of caveats are put in place to make sure that they can defend themselves against the case that they're going to spend, you know, 600 billion pounds on rich people, as the kind of Conservative Party attack often was to the Labour Party. So either we see kind of strong support from parties with their arms tied behind their back, or parties with support at arm's length. The other interesting thing I found, particularly in the UK and Finland, where we see some of the I guess the warmest indications of support from trade unions, particularly PAM in Finland and Unite and TUC in the UK, were also said some warm things at conferences and so on about basic income. When you dig into particularly those involved in the leadership of those unions, but also even within the kind of middle management of the unions, basically those statements are the best attempts to fob off some support from the members for a policy that they fundamentally oppose. So, you know, in particular PAM, which in Finland, which had a lot of support from its members due to having a lot of precarious workers and so on, the kind of leadership and other people around the leadership in that union could not have been more opposed to basic income as an actual policy. So even when we see quite significant support from certain trade unions, the kind of reality, at least within the kind of decision makers within those unions, is that there is not only no support, but also active opposition, and all of their strategies, even with the expression of support, are designed to block the kind of progress to do with basic income rather than to progress it. So where does kind of, even when there's this arm's length support, or kind of arms tied behind their back type support, where does this tend to lead? Well, I kind of mapped out the kinds of commitments that parties gave in party manifestos, depending on whether they committed to introducing the policy, whether they wanted to investigate or explore the policy, which often was a kind of, I guess, a fobbing off type strategy for the party, or do some kind of experiment or test. Or the most interesting and often the most common was to express basic income as a long-term goal, and then also to specify a number of steps that the parties would make in the short term to lead to kind of progressing towards this goal. And often the parties that seemed to express the most sincere support for basic income tended to take this approach. So you can see that in the Left Alliance and the Greens in Finland, which have had a very long-standing support for basic income. And one of the reasons they've, I think, been able to kind of manage this twin strong support for basic income whilst also participating in government coalitions and having an impact on policy is this kind of expression of basic income as a long-term goal, and then making a series of suggestions for steps towards basic income as the policy. And just as an example of some of the policies that they would support as kind of steps towards that goal, whilst in government in the 2011-2015 coalition, the Greens and the Left Alliance campaigned to individualize and remove the means test from the non-contributory unemployment benefit. So previously, if you did not have a contribution record and you were claiming unemployment benefit, you could not receive that benefit if your household had a certain level of income or a certain level of savings. So they campaigned to remove that kind of condition so that you could receive non-contributory unemployment benefits simply from being unemployed, rather than having to prove that you were poor enough or you didn't have enough savings to receive it. So, you know, it's certainly not a basic income, but you can see at least the ways in which it's inspired by basic income and how that might move the system in a kind of more basic income-y direction. A slightly more controversial one that those parties claimed as a policy in the direction of basic income was that they kind of they increased the earnings disregard. So they basically the amount of money you can earn before the benefit is taken away, and also lowered the taper rate as you earn more, how much of it is taken away. And so they argued that that was also a kind of step towards basic income, in the sense at least that they're reducing marginal effective tax rates on outsiders and people on the very lowest incomes, and that was a step in some way towards basic income, given that it's one of its key logics is to do that. So just to finish, I kind of wanted to talk about my way of thinking about how different parties and actors advocate basic income, and in particular, if you like, the different levels of abstraction that people think of basic income. And so the first one is probably the one that most people are used to thinking of basic income, which is as a policy. You know, it has a certain set of characteristics which cannot be deviated from. So those are that it's individual, it's universal, it's unconditional, there's no kind of requirements attached to it, and it's paid to everyone in the community, and that if it's not that, it's not a basic income. So that's basic income as a policy. And I know that Troy in particular sees Luke Martinelli as his nemesis in academia, but I am going to just mention his trilemma when designing basic income as a policy, which is that often you struggle to make a basic income affordable, adequate, and completely simplify the system, as you know, by replacing many of the existing means-tested benefits. And so in reality, when you look at most proposals that think tanks or political parties design with basic income as an actual policy, they are often actually those that are at a very low level, or at least at a low level compared to the kind of support that low-income families will get if they have, for example, children or housing needs or disability and so on. But either funded through getting rid of tax allowances and very small increases in tax bands. So in a sense, you know, this kind of partial UBI where it's a kind of almost like a tax reform, and using a basic income tax reform and using a basic income as part of that tax reform, or to find some kind of new tax or source to pay a dividend, which may be low and variable in lots of ways. So Alaska obviously being the most famous example, but also there are proposals from the Royal Society of Arts to tax data and pay that as a basic income, or to kind of print money as sovereign money and just give that to people as a kind of macroeconomic device. Or I actually don't know a huge amount about this, and if there's anybody in this talk who does know about the Canadian climate change incentive payment, then it'd be great to speak to you. But from my understanding, that certain Canadian provinces have used a carbon tax to pay an unconditional, very small unconditional income to all residents. But the key point here is that, you know, neither of these policies are going to completely get rid of conditionality in the system. They're not going to get rid of means testing. These are very much supplements or kind of integration with the existing system rather than replacement in lots of ways. And both of them also have their own political challenges. So I think probably you know, my main argument is, in a sense, that the ways that political parties and even kind of adjunct campaigners for basic income that are interested in electoral politics, at least, often think of basic income more as a mirror. And I use the word mirror rather than kind of thought experiment or long-term goal, because precisely because the features of a basic income which are most salient in a particular context are often the ones which clash most obviously with the existing system. So if you are in a context like Finland, where you have a huge amount of earnings-related benefits and social insurance, often basic income is kind of viewed as a kind of non-contributory benefit. So both the Centre Party and the Left Alliance and the Greens often can advocate for basic income almost half as UBI, but also half as basically just saying we're going to protect the non-contributory benefit system. And they're able to do that because of the context in which earnings-related benefits play such a large role. Whereas in contexts such as you know, Australia or the UK, visualizing basic income as a non-contributory benefit, it sort of doesn't really make any sense, because all of our benefits, in a sense, are already non-contributory. So in those kind of contexts, you know, the extent to which, particularly in the UK during the 2010s, you know, the huge increase in sanctions and conditionality made that aspect of a basic income particularly salient, and led to huge amounts of campaigning around basic income related to the use of sanctions in the UK. So this table, which I'm running out of time, so I won't go into huge amounts of detail, but it's basically saying that for each feature of basic income, you have a kind of implicit goal, which is related to that feature, and then also a kind of policy trajectory, which is imagined towards basic income as a long-term goal. And often you find in the kind of manifesto commitments of political parties that support basic income. So, you know, in the US, for example, UBI is very much visualized as effectively cash. You know, in the US, there's a kind of ability to bring all sorts of different actors together under the hood of basic income or guaranteed income, because there are such a widespread use of food vouchers and a number of other kind of aspects of the social security system which are not necessarily cash first based. And so that brings a lot more people around the movement kind of under the hood of basic income, whilst really being a kind of let's increase the use of cash within the social security system. And obviously, so the reason why that's a salient context is because of the existing use of vouchers or hypothecated benefits. The last point, because I think this is also quite important to state, and again, this often is also the case with certain political actors, particularly in countries. I think I'm thinking here about, for example, the Green Party in the UK, which has, in a sense, no real prospect of participating in government with only one MP, but where, if you like, the aim of electoral politics is to change the conversation, and is to try and force people to think about the way in which our political and economic system thinks about certain things, and in particular, I would say the role of work and money. And so, in a sense, basic income here is if you like, a metaphor for other values within our society or our socioeconomic system, rather than a policy or even a kind of direction in terms of the social security system that we want to move in. And it's you often heard political actors even using the word, basic income is a tool, or it's a device for us to have these conversations about the meaning of work, about automation or degrowth, and the role of money within capitalism. And the kind of interesting thing, particularly within social democratic parties, is often the kind of big divide is on these issues. It's not so much on the policy details of whether we have more or less conditionality, or we have more or less contributory benefits, or whatever. Those kind of debates are often quite a lot smaller or a lot less heated than what is the role of work and what is the role of cash benefits versus public services, in a broader sense. And that's often where basic income finds the kind of the most divides within politics, is almost nothing to do with it as a policy, but as these kind of representations of what does work, what is the importance of work in our society, and what is the importance of cash benefits versus public services, or money in general. And I think, to say something perhaps productive rather than just kind of waffly analytical here, I think digging into what is driving differences between people on the left, for example, about basic income would be helpful if we think about trying to heal some of those I think unnecessarily divisive arguments about basic income, when often, if you think about the kind of short-term policy solutions that both sides are proposing, often there is very little disagreement, whereas the kind of the big debates about what does work mean, or should we have universal basic services or universal basic income, as if the two are necessarily are alternatives, rather than both part. Cash benefits and public services are both part of any kind of redistributive government program, I think would be helpful. So I hope that was relatively interesting and enlightening, and I'd be interested to hear everyone's responses. So I will mute now. Shall I? Yeah.
Thank you very much. Hopefully that will work. It has worked. Okay. Thank you very much, Joe. That was a fantastic presentation. Apologies for the slight technical hitches we've been having, but I think we're almost there. So now we're going to go on and have two reflections that I think connect some of what Joe was just saying to the context we have in Australia. And I think Joe already started to do that, in fact, in some of those remarks. So thank you. So Dr. Eve Vincent is the Discipline Chair of Anthropology here at the Macquarie School of Social Sciences. She's also one of our inaugural fellows of the Australian Basic Income Lab, and I know a couple of others here in the room and online as well. That's the program we've just launched, so we're going to be doing more about that soon. Thank you very much for everyone who has, and particularly thank you to Eve. Eve is going to be speaking on the themes that Joe raised, but also drawing on her new book, I think, Who Cares? The Life on Welfare in Australia, that was recently published by Melbourne University Press, and quite a lot of the rest of her research. So I might invite Eve up to speak. And Joe, I might just ask if you can stop sharing screen now as well, and then I'll pin Eve up. Thanks.
Okay, am I good to go?
You are.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks, Ben, for the opportunity to be part of this event, and thank you for the acknowledgement of country. Okay, so I'll keep it brief. I just want to highlight three things that strike me about this conversation from an Australian vantage point. So first, Joe has noted that different facets of the basic income proposal are foregrounded in different contexts, i.e. the most salient dimensions of a UBI are usually those that clash most obviously with the existing social security system. Agreed. In the Australian context, the potential non-conditionality of the idea of basic income is its most startling feature. This draws a strong contrast with the character of the contemporary social security system. So Australia has long had a tightly targeted system. Historically, male wages set through the arbitration system were envisaged to be the primary defence against poverty. The 20th century system has, of course, evolved into a social security system that shares features with the global shift across Anglophone countries made towards highly conditional, even more stringently targeted welfare states with these high rates of sanctions that Joe mentioned. Targeted social security has a double meaning here, as the compliance regimes result in a pervasive experience of digitised surveillance and of feeling oneself the target or object of scrutiny, suspicion, intervention, and contempt. That's not to say that people don't also draw on their inner resources, alternate values, and shared circumstances to cope with these psychic and material harms. But certainly the basic income idea offers the promise of release or liberation from being a target, not just of spending, but of reform and derision. And this is what I document in my book, Who Cares? Second, you'll note that I've begun by placing everyday experience at the centre of the conversation rather than political parties. And I think one of the really interesting things about the debate about the social security system in Australia right now is the contestation around expertise. So the emergence of grounded storytelling and analysis and policy formulation from organised networks of people bearing the brunt of this cruel system increasingly shapes broader public understanding of poverty here. This does involve a challenge to academic expertise, which is very bracing, but I also think very welcome. So I see this as primarily a documentary exercise. And I think the latest report from the Anti-Poverty Centre about private employment services providers is an outstanding example of this, and I highly recommend it. I think it's called Punishment for Profit. So policy formulation in terms of something as visionary as basic income inherently has a more speculative aspect to it and is more tangential to direct experience and to these documentary efforts. So I guess I'm wondering where this leaves this debate, given the primacy increasingly accorded to experience, which in turn authorises the capacity to speak. It seems to me that the idea of basic income emanates from something or somewhere else. So Ben has done really interesting work about receptivity to the idea of basic income in Australia, finding increased support among renters and precarious workers on the one hand, and educated progressives with post-materialist values on the other. But I'm sort of shifting the question from receptivity slightly to talk about the source of the idea. Where does the vocabulary come from, the terminology? This is the question of voice. So to be clear, I'm not advancing an anti-intellectual critique that doesn't appreciate speculative thinking or academic contributions to social debate. But this is a point of interest, I think. So where does the conversation emanate from? Where is this generated from? This is what I'm asking. Third, and this goes to Joe's point about basic income as a device. It strikes me that in terms of the possibility of joining the basic income conversation to conversations that clearly emanate from elsewhere, the current federal government's focus on productivity is important and will only continue. So there's a lot we can say about productivity, and none of this is particularly original. How do you even measure productivity in a service economy which produces immaterial goods and indeed feelings rather than things? Non-wage labour is also productive. These are labours expended on producing things like caring kin relations and meals to eat. But then again, what is lost when we absorb all of our activities in the world into this master category of productivity? Is productivity a byword for capitalist growth that we can't afford to pursue in a carbon-constrained future? What if employers are driven to produce things like rushed, absurdly pointless, and even outright abusive appointments with vulnerable people? So is increased productivity really something that we should be urged and desired? So I think interrogating and indeed politicising the crisis in productivity and its normative assumptions has a lot of potential for stimulating conversations that are germane to the basic income conversation. So they're the three sort of things I wanted to throw into the conversation tonight.
Thanks very much, Eve. And thanks also for the people who are putting comments in the screen as we go through. We'll hopefully have a little bit of time to open it up to questions at the end. So next we have Dr. Troy Henderson, who's a Senior Research Officer at the Mental Wealth Initiative at the University of Sydney, and he's also a fellow co-director of the Australian Basic Income Lab. Troy is one of Australia's leading basic income scholars. He's just returned from Seoul from the Basic Income Earth Network conference there. And he's going to be drawing on collaborative research that examines the attitudes of Australian unions and the role of unions and basic income, particularly in Australia. So Troy, I'm going to ask you to unmute, and I'm going to mute the thing here, and hopefully that will work.
Cheers, Ben. Thanks, everyone. I'll just check quickly. Can people hear me? Can people hear me? Yep. Cool. Awesome. Thanks so much for the invitation, for the great presentations from Joe and Eve. We have some really fantastic people who've turned up today, so I might try and keep my presentation to about a minute, so at least a couple of people can ask a question. I wanted to start by acknowledging the Whadjuk people of Noongar Nation as the traditional custodians of the country I'm on today, over here in Perth in WA, and to thank Ben in particular for putting this event together. Joe, I'll just say quickly, Luke Martinelli is not exactly my bête noire, and I do disagree that his policy trilemma is insurmountable, and I recommend anyone interested in basic income should take a look at Luke Martinelli's work, because it's excellent and provocative and interesting. As I said, I'm going to try and be really, really quick and just maybe say three things. So I start from a basic principle or premise or ethic, whatever you want to call it, that money income, called basic income, is a basic need in a capitalist society in a way that paid work is not, and therefore it should be a basic right in a capitalist society. But throughout its entire intellectual history, basic income has been an object, a reform goal without an agent. And we're still trying to identify what that agent or combination of agents might look like in different contexts. And I wanted to link that to both Joe's presentation, but more broadly to a point about basic income research, which relates to the basic income movement. And I don't know if he's still online, but I was going to plug Tej Lennon's book, whose name I probably just butchered, which is an excellent book, so excellent that I've just forgotten the name of it, but it's about the popularity of basic income, Palgrave Macmillan. I suggest you look it up, because when I started my PhD in 2015, it was quite easy to read everything published on basic income each year. Now it's completely impossible. And part of that is this emerging body of scholarship around quite complex analysis of attitudes, as we saw represented in Joe's presentation and in Tej's book and other work by Femke Rujma and Ben Spies-Butcher as well, looking into the levels of support for basic income, but also the determinants of support and the different affiliations of supporters and how strong or weak that support might be. And that type of data, if you like, is absolutely integral to moving from basic income being this magical carpet that's going to lift us all up to a policy reality and to thinking through political strategies informed by that information. Now, I realize I haven't mentioned trade unions yet, and Ben said I was going to talk about that. And look, I do have a chapter in the second edition of the Palgrave Handbook of Basic Income on trade unions and basic income. And the key point to make there is basic trade unions have traditionally shown very little interest, if not at times outright hostility towards the idea of basic income for various reasons. But we what Joe's talk reinforced for me was the need for more of these detailed institutional internal histories of why a particular institution came to support basic income. Were they forced into it by the rank and file, which I would argue is a good thing, or was it, you know, a very superficial attachment to a particular charismatic leader at a brief moment in time? And even looking at a very recent experience during COVID, you know, COSATU, which has a tradition in South Africa of supporting types of basic income, a basic income grant, and SAFTU came back to a position, so two federations, of supporting basic income triggered by COVID, somewhat like the United Workers Union in Australia, including a type of basic income in its package of COVID response measures, whereas the Dutch Federation of Trade Unions came around to supporting basic income after a process of 5 years of internal debate. It had nothing to do with COVID. So I think I just want to link to the utility of this emerging and developing, the importance of this body of scholarship, and for us then to link that to political strategies. And for me, in terms of an Australian example, the best one I've been able to think of that might have some utility for basic income advocates, I was going to say going forward, and I hate that term so much, I have to say, you know, progressing, is how we came to have a form of public health care, where you did see alignments of the trade union movement and community activists and the political party. And it took a long time, including absolute failures and reversals. But we can learn from this new scholarship and from historical examples that are attuned to the dynamics of our own institutions and cultures, linking back to some of the points Eve made. Okay, that's it from me. Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thanks, Troy. Can you put yourself on mute? Okay, hopefully that's worked again. Beautiful. So we've been having a number of comments and questions in the chat, and maybe just drawing your attention to some of those for the people who are online. I'm going to first go to a question in the room, letting people know, so start to indicate if you've got one, and then go to a question online. We won't have heaps of time to do that, but we'll get through what we can. But before I did any of that, I just wanted to check in with Joe whether he had any reflections that he wanted to add first.
Yeah, I probably won't use up too much time because I did go slightly over with my talk. But what I would say just about I guess that there's kind of two political strategies really to be grappling with. One is how you bring allies, if you like, into the movement, but the other is, if you like, what your actual demands are in the short to medium term. And I think those two things are often more intertwined than they're sometimes approached. You know, there's a kind of, let's just advocate basic income and then try and bring as many people under the hood as possible. Whereas actually, you know, having a clear sense of some of the more short-term kind of demands might also help some of the kind of bringing people under the hood of basic income goals. So, you know, in a response to Troy, much of which I completely agreed with, in terms of, you know, the kind of scholarship that's been happening recently has been really, really great, including Tez's work, who's here, yeah. So just I'll leave it at that for now.
Thanks very much, Joe. Wonderful. Thank you very much, Joe. So do we have any questions in the room? Yeah, Francesco. And hopefully we'll be able to hear you through this. I'll see whether that can be made to happen. So, Joe, I think the question was, what led you to select Finland and the UK as cases?
So the main driver of Finland was that at the time it was where the kind of most action to do with basic income was happening. So the basic income experiment had been announced and so on. Although, as it turned out, some of the most interesting things that I found about Finland was actually the stuff that happened prior to the experiment during the government that was that existed beforehand. But yeah, I mean, I was drawn in by the experiment, and the UK I already knew a huge amount about, so that shortened the kind of level of context that I needed to learn. So that's why I picked those two. And at the time, there were interesting things happening in the UK too, because Scotland was planning a pilot, and actually the kind of internal one thing I didn't mention in the presentation was internally within the UK, there's a kind of interesting comparison of strategies because the Green Party is actually very institutionally separate in Scotland and England and Wales. And the Green Party in Scotland operates within a system of proportional representation where they are actually kind of actively involved with the SNP government. At the moment, they're in a coalition government. And you could see the difference in strategy between a party that has to engage with government versus a party that basically can say whatever it wants and will never have to act on what they're saying. So the kind of UK also ended up being quite an interesting kind of experiment, if you like, or like not experiment, but like a natural comparison of how the context influences strategies for basic income supporting parties, and so those were the kind of motivations for the UK and Finland.
Thanks very much. Yeah, that's great. Sorry about this. So we've got a couple of questions online. I might take both of them together and then we'll have a final wrap up from Joe. So they're Emma and Tyes. So Emma, would you like to ask the first question?
Yeah, okay, great. That was an excellent talk. I really like that table towards the end of like the UBI features and the policy strategies. I thought that was like really concise and useful. I do sort of reflect that a lot of this cheap support in terms of policy implementation seems to be a feature of political change in general for almost all sorts of ambitious political change that it has these elements. And I was wondering if you've looked into potentially like other political change movements that are maybe more mature, and whether there's like analogous sort of strategies there that could be utilized for the basic income movement.
Thank you. Can you mute? Thanks very much, Emma. Tyes, will you be able to ask your question, and I'll mute here.
Yes, thank you. So, Joe, thanks again for a very interesting talk. Whenever you speak, I have lots of questions I want to ask you, but I'll stick to one question. I'll email you with some other questions later. So what really fascinates me about your work is that you combine this public support and political support into one framework. But I was wondering whether in the interviews you did with the policymakers, whether you also talked about how they perceive public opinion and how they respond or not respond to public opinion. So if you could give any insights on that, that would be great. Thank you.
And Joe, I'll switch straight to you.
Great. Okay, so on the cheap support thing, so the first part of the answer is very short, which is I haven't looked at other movements and policies, but that's a great idea. One thing I would say about the maturity of a movement, though, is, again, the comparison between UK and Finland was very instructive in that sense, because Finland has basically had 2 or 3 political parties that have supported basic income since the 1990s. And so they've kind of matured into how they've learned how to kind of balance this, have this balancing act between supporting basic income whilst also making some reforms that they can achieve in the short term. Whereas in the UK, there was a lot more of this, like, what is the meaning of work? What is, you know, the role of cash versus public service? You know, these very kind of big questions which kind of didn't really go anywhere. I mean, we can talk about you know, the successes or the failures of the Corbyn Labour Party till the cows come home, but in terms of purely the kind of basic income side of it, you know, there was a lot of abstract discussion and very little kind of actual, how are we going to improve the social security system, you know, whether that means a fully fledged basic income or these kind of smaller steps. That kind of discussion just wasn't had at all, and I would link that really to the kind of maturity of the movement in some sense. But I accept that there's a normative spin there from me rather than a kind of apolitical, purely empirical interpretation. So on the public opinion thing, it's a really interesting one, and again, there were differences. So in the UK, I would say basically everyone thought that the public would take a huge amount of persuading, you know, that this was a long-term battle. If we were going to get people on board for basic income, that, you know, they basically did not believe the polling evidence is what the politicians almost all said. You know, they said, yeah, you know, everyone can support anything in the polls, that kind of attitude, and thought that, you know, they would have to really take them slowly through it, and so that there wasn't this attitude at all that this was an electoral opportunity to like win over voters that they didn't already have. That just was not at all mentioned in the UK. In Finland, because it has this like kind of twin meaning of UBI, but also what they called basic security, so that, you know, the non-contributory benefit system. UBI is a kind of representation of that. If you support UBI or you support basic income, you also support improvements to the kind of non-contributory system. You know, they had clear constituencies in mind that they were targeting when they supported basic income. You know, there was like precarious workers, you know, people, students, you know, people who benefit from that system, who they would vote for those parties. So in that sense, there was a much clearer link between their constituencies and the kind of support for basic income. And I guess to some extent that's also an electoral system point, because, you know, the UK being a majoritarian system, there's a much more of a kind of median voter type focus, whereas in Finland there was much more of this kind of, we have our voters and that's who we represent, and that's why we support basic income. So I hope that made sense, and yeah, thanks for the great questions, both really good.
Thanks very much. Joe? Yes, wonderful. And we're right on time. So unfortunately, we probably do need to have a little bit more of an extended discussion at some point. We have a bit more interest than I think we thought we were going to have. So thank you. I'd just like to bring it to a close now by, first of all, thanking our three wonderful speakers, who I think gave an excellent engagement, and particularly Joe for running us through the politics of basic income. To the Macquarie School of Social Sciences, and particularly to Payal Ray and Emma Jago, who set this up and made sure that all of it worked. A really big thank you. And then thank you all of the people in the room here and all the people online. It's been great to have you join, and hopefully we'll see you at another social science and basic income event soon. Farewell.